Hi everyone, and welcome to a very special episode of Flourish FM. Very special because this is the first of a two-part series with our guest. Our guest in this episode is Dr. Rick Hanson. He's a psychologist, senior fellow at the University of California, Berkeley's Greater Good Science Center, and a New York Times bestselling author. His 7 books have been published in 31 languages and include Making Great Relationships, which is among the areas of focus in our second part of this 2-episode series, Neurodharma, Resilient, Hardwiring Happiness, Just One Thing, Buddha's Brain, and Mother Nurture, with over 1 million copies sold in English alone. Rick is the founder of the Global Compassion Coalition and the Wellspring Institute for Neuroscience and Contemplative Wisdom, as well as the co-host of the Being Well podcast, which has been downloaded over 15 million times. His free newsletters have 250,000 subscribers, and his online programs have scholarships available for those with financial needs. Rick has lectured at NASA, Google, Oxford, and Harvard. He's an expert on positive neuroplasticity, and his work has been featured in major media outlets including CBS, NPR, and the BBC. He began meditation in 1974 and has taught in meditation centers worldwide. Now, as you can tell from Rick's bio, his expertise on well-being spans many areas, many diverse areas, and we try to cover several of these in this 2-part episode series. In the first, we focus on his work on mindfulness, neuroplasticity, and what he calls hardwiring for happiness. And we also focus on resilience, coping with stress and stress management, and trauma, and coping with trauma and recovering from trauma. In the second part of this series, we focus on relationships and well-being, the relationship between them, and Rick's most recent book, Making Great Relationships. In this episode, there are many excellent highlights. One that I particularly loved was discussing Rick's distinction between what's called the green zone and the red zone. So the green zone, when you're kind of in the green zone in life, it's when you feel calm and collected, that you can handle the difficulties in life. And the red zone is when you're facing huge amounts of adversity in your life, you are under a lot of pressure, there is extremely difficult time for you. And some of Rick's work tries to show us how we can cultivate practices that can enable us to remain in the green zone when things in life, as it were, are red, and be prepared for entering the red zone without ourselves going into, as it were, a red state, but maintaining our state in the green zone. And he's done some very well-backed scientific research on how you can maintain a life in that state as effectively as possible in the face of the difficulties that life throws our way. That is to say, the red zone things in life. It's a fascinating conversation. Rick's a phenomenal speaker and researcher and writer, among many other skills he has. We hope you love this episode.
Greetings. Boy, have I been looking forward to this.
Not as much as we have.
I don't know.
How you doing?
I feel great, honestly. Thank you for asking.
Thanks for being with us.
It's a pleasure to both of you, Nick and John.
Yeah, we're looking forward to this conversation. Been a big fan of yours for a while. We'll get into, I think, a variety of areas that you have expertise in, and really excited to share that knowledge with our audience. I think we're going to start with kind of a conceptual question, if you will. I really enjoyed looking through your website. Side note, I think it's a great design, by the way. It's a real, true learning center. It's excellent. In thumbing through it and kind of prepping for the interview and being familiar with your work, there's so much we can take in and identify. And at the same time, what I kind of noticed is you don't necessarily see language like thriving or flourishing. And I'm really interested in digging into that with you. And we generally open with a question like this, but obviously the name of the show, Flourish FM, sponsored by the Human Flourishing Program. I'm just kind of curious, how do you feel about a term like flourishing? Is it something that you use? Is it something that you would challenge or push back against? And maybe we can anchor the conversation there for starters.
Well, for starters, I did a near master's thesis on self-actualization and its relationship to self-disclosure, but certainly foregrounding that level or way of being that Maslow called out, with its emphasis on being needs distinct from deficiency needs, which he allocated to the underlying structure. And right there, we have a key point about well-being and flourishing, in that if we're not safe, if we're hungry, if we're not satisfied, and if we're not connected, to call out three primary needs, in which there's a deficiency in the meeting of the need, our well-being and our flourishing are certainly undermined. It's when there's an enoughness in the authentic experiencing of the individual, even in circumstances that can be very challenging. But if there's a sense of enoughness in the meeting of our fundamental needs, then there's an opening into self-actualization, flourishing, and thriving. So there's context here. So I'm a fan of thriving. I'm a fan of flourishing. I'm a fan of self-actualizing. I was reflecting on this question in that I think there's kind of a overlap, if you will, of the two constructs of flourishing, let's say, and well-being, let's say. They overlap a lot. I think of flourishing having to do with sort of more the upper reaches, really, of human potential, including in a context that is real for me of spaces of awakening broadly that move beyond everyday well-being, certainly, and even conventional notions of flourishing. So you have the upper reaches of things. Well-being also, for me, relates more to my clinical background as a psychologist, many years, and really thinking about how people can come to terms with external conditions that are very constraining and limiting. I mean, how would we speak of flourishing right now for people, let's say, who are still shocked by atrocities in Israel, or managing as civilians to raise their children somehow in Gaza right now today? Right. I mean, how would flourishing gets constrained by conditions, and also people, let's say, who are grappling with chronic health issues or chronic pain, loss, trauma, so forth. So how can people dealing with that still experience those conditions and deal with those underlying pains and losses in a context of well-being, right? Which is actually available to us wonderfully, but we have to kind of work at it. So I think of that as a space that I wouldn't really call out flourishing for, and yet well-being, an authentic, resilient well-being, is actually available still in the innermost core of a person.
Can we pick up on one term there, spaces of awakening? Can you tell us a little more what you mean by that?
Oh, dear. Oh, yes. So I think of healing, growing, awakening, as kind of loosely defined, blurring in their distinctions, spaces. I think of the process of growth and conventionally well-being and flourishing as applied to the content of what we're experiencing. So people who are flourishing are having more moments, let's say, of the experience of actualizing or thriving or just doing really well, okay? Awakening is really the process having to do with our relationship to the contents of consciousness. To what extent can we rest in a kind of untroubled, loving awareness as the container of our sorrows, let's say, or over time, do we rest, let's say, calling on the Buddhist tradition, in an ongoing insight into the inherent ephemerality, the emptiness, the insubstantiality of experience existing emptily, which undermines, with that insight, attachment and clinging and identification with experiences and phenomena in ways that are liberating and freeing, progressing, and or ultimately for many people, awakening involves some kind of intuiting or resting or faith in an underlying transcendental ground of all that's significant, that's meaningfully, categorically, ontologically distinct from the naturalistic Big Bang universe.
It's interesting
Trying to be succinct there.
No, it's great. Yeah,
That was
it's really interesting to hear the way you're thinking about this and describing this, because first of all, you mentioned self-actualization. We're both big fans of that term, that research. Scott Barry Kossman's a personal friend. I don't know if you two know each other. You must. I would think
I think our paths have crossed. Yeah.
Okay, I would hope so. But obviously that's a huge topic for him, and we had him on the show. I think episode 3, and he really challenged the idea of flourishing in some ways, and I think was focused more on a growth orientation. But I'm not sure these terms are necessarily mutually exclusive, and so I really like the way you talked about it. And if I can oversimplify it, it sounds like you would typically hear, say like a Marty Seligman at the start of a field of positive psychology say there's, move people from miserable to less miserable to content to flourishing. And now maybe you're adding, fully to awakening and self-actualization. Does that feel like an accurate portrayal?
I think that's a fair statement, and as a potential developmental progression for an individual, I would distinguish self-actualization from the process of awakening, which again, to emphasize it, for many people is related to some kind of relationship with a ontologically, meaningfully distinct, transcendental, divine something, ground, mystery. B, from the standpoint of spiritual traditions and that context, there's a lot about how we hold the process. So people can be in a frame in which they're moving through miserable. There is misery, there is pain, there is loss, there is sorrow, there is moral outrage, there is anguish, there is misery in a context for an individual authentically who will report in which they're completely untroubled by it. And here I think there's a useful distinction the Buddha marked metaphorically, you may know it, between the first arrow and second arrow, the first dart and the second dart, in which in the first dart there may well be misery or less misery, let's say, or ordinary getting through the day. That's the first dart. That's unavoidable, it's real, it's understandable. Of course you're upset about this. Of course you're in pain. Of course you're anguished. Of course you're depressed. It's real. And the person is not bothered by that fact. There's a growing equanimity, peacefulness, and spaciousness in relationship to that, what's present. So then I want to kind of almost call that like an orthogonal dimension having to do with our relationship to, or the space in which that is occurring as an authentic, real experience. And so that would be a little orthogonal to that linear progression that you sketched there. But just with those little add-ons, yeah, you got it. It's been real for me in my own process.
Yeah. It sounds like the potential for the presence of unpleasantness alongside acceptance. I'm thinking of my friend and partner, Adam Wright, who spends a lot of time working on acceptance commitment techniques. And that's what resonated right there as you said that to me. Is that kind of what we're scratching at here?
Yeah. And then there are depths of that sense of freedom in relationship to that which is really challenging.
So it sets up, I think, kind of the first area we really want to take a deeper dive into. And you referenced, I think, the kind of these 3 core needs already, but this idea in Hardwiring for Happiness of the red zone and the green zone, which I've always taken as maybe sort of a difference between a deficit state and at minimum homeostasis or a contentedness. Maybe not down the line towards the flourishing, thriving, self-actualization, certainly not awakening, but kind of that basic foundation. So I have kind of 2 questions. 1, am I understanding that correctly? And 2, would you just kind of simply explain the idea of a red zone and green zone to our listeners?
Yeah, I think you totally got it. And I want to start with the title of Robert Sapolsky's Gem of a classic. I bet you've read it. Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. So in the wild, and these are our cousins whose nervous systems are very much like our own, especially fellow mammals, particularly related to emotion and motivation. Fundamental kind of primal qualities. So the zebras, let's say we're 3 of us are zebras. We're hanging out in zebra world and we're just chilling. We're eating grass. We're conserving resources. And then suddenly the lions attack. So now if time is flowing this way, and if you're just listening, I'm drawing my arm across here. mellow, green zone. There's an enoughness, safe enough, they're fed, satisfied enough, and there's a sense of connectedness with each other in their zebra-like ways. Enoughness, green. Whoa, lions attack. Spike of red zone stress. Fight, flight, firing up in the familiar ways, amygdala activation, the HVA axis gets going, the whole package. Woo, really intense. And it usually, as Sapolsky puts it, most episodes of stress in the wild end quickly, one way or another. Maybe one zebra gets nailed, good for the lions, bad for the zebra, and the rest of us, we settle down really rapidly. So you can see that distinction right there, and people can experience it. The problem with modern life is that we live in the pink zone. Most people live in the pink zone, if not bright or red, most minutes of most days, accumulating, term you're familiar with, allostatic load, the gradual wear and tear on body and mind, which then proliferates into wear and tear in our relationships and in our activities. And we're accumulating that load over time. We're not designed to clock a lot of time in pink zone, red zone stress. And so a way of understanding it is in terms of coping with challenges while recovering as rapidly as possible from spikes of red zone stress. And in fact, being able to deal with challenges. And I'm not sure I could deal with the challenge of being chased by a lion without some red zone stress. I raced into our apartment building, which was burning at one end, 7 units. So we were the 7th unit, so it was close. And while my wife was yelling at me not to be an idiot, I raced back into our apartment to grab my shoes, my car keys, my dissertation discs, and my 2-year-old son's teddy bear. And then raced out again. Okay.
Wow.
I'm fine with being in the red zone, right? But man, it's not a prescription for long-term well-being or thriving. And so for me, that distinction is useful, and it points to the importance of, through social justice and policy and action, reducing the external conditions that just push people, like poverty or mismanaging a plague, push people into red zone states. Certainly that's deeply important, addressing systemic injustice and so forth. Meanwhile, building up psychological strengths inside to meet your needs for safety, satisfaction, and connection without tipping into red zone stress. You may be a little revved up, you may be a little irritated, but you're not flooded in your core. There's a line from the Buddha a long time ago talking about his own awakening. Painful racking feelings arose, but they did not penetrate my mind and remained. That's the distinction. They arise, but they don't have to penetrate and remain, right? And so that's gotten me very interested in how do we build up psychological muscles, as it were, to function in the face of challenges without moving into the red zone. And also, how do we repeatedly, second, internalize green zone experiences to gradually hardwire an unshakable core of resilient well-being inside, on the basis of which we meet the challenges of life.
I'm really interested in something you just mentioned there, which was without moving into the red zone. And I think, but please correct me if I'm wrong, part of my understanding of this is the red zone isn't necessarily a bad thing. It has some utility. We actually need it in certain situations. What I think I'm hearing, and you mentioned allostatic load, it's about the consistency or the ratio as opposed to kind of cycling on, cycling off. I really like the idea of the pink zone. That makes a lot of sense, right? Not being in either one of the zones, kind of sitting in between in some ways. Are we understanding that correctly, or are we saying like, red zone's pretty bad, we generally don't want to be in the red zone in any way, shape, or form, or for any reason?
Yeah, this goes to a kind of meme that flies around a lot these days, that it's only through red zone experiences that we grow. And this is very important, actually. And there's also a kind of meme floating around, I suspect you both have encountered it, that pushes against notions of flourishing, thriving, or positive psychology or positivity as kind of delusional in the face of the challenges of the world, and a denial of what's difficult, and also a kind of for people who sort of need to live with rose-colored glasses. And I think all of that, frankly, from a pure biological standpoint, is complete BS. First of all, most pain has no gain. Gradual wear and tear of anxiety, irritation, sorrow, self-doubt, self-criticism, exasperation, conflict gradually wears people down. It shortens the lifespan, gradually exposes people to various risks in terms of illness and so on. And it really wears down people's quality of life just unnecessarily, actually. And as you know from my stuff and other sources, the brain has a negativity bias that makes it, as I say, like Velcro for bad experiences, but Teflon for positive ones. So there's a particularly intensive impact, even of, on the 0 to 10 scale, the 1s and the 2s and the 3s of emotionally negative experiences in everyday life. They really add up over time. And if a person is vulnerable, either biologically, temperamentally, and or from their life experiences, particularly in childhood, traumatic experiences or painful, difficult experiences that add up over time, a lot of micro traumas become a macro trauma. Then with that vulnerability, what might seem like to another person who's more resilient, just a minor 2 or 3 or 4 on the yuck scale, for them, boom, lands really hard and affects them more in lasting ways. So don't underestimate or trivialize the power of chronically painful, difficult, challenging experiences. Also, let's not be sure not to use that to justify social policies that ignore the impact or underestimate, the impact. So, and it is true. I think there are certain key inner strengths, inner qualities, factors of even flourishing. They are only acquired through really difficult experiences. Like I know things myself that have come through nearly dying multiple times in wilderness through my own foolishness, usually while rock climbing and doing other things, or nearly drowning. Yes, that's really true. But we also need to always ask, even if people have post-traumatic growth, even if they gain from their pain, could they have acquired those similar psychological factors as traits inside themselves, positive traits? Could they have acquired those character strengths? Speaking of Peterson and Park and Seligman's work, character strengths, could they have acquired those strengths through other means? And in fact, if you think of what we're trying to acquire inside, fill it in: inner calm, pro-social motivations, emotional intelligence, mindfulness, compassion, self-compassion, self-worth, happiness altogether, right? Whatever it is we want to acquire inside. How do we acquire it? How do we acquire it? Through positive neuroplasticity. We acquire it through having experiences of it that are internalized. And most experiences of the good we want to grow inside are affectively positive. They feel good because they're good for us, right? So the positivity of an experience is not to be clung to, right, or identified with, and so forth. On the other hand, the positivity of an experience is usually a marker of its value, because we evolved systems that mark and motivate our ancestors to seek those experiences and grow from them. So that is kind of a bit of a fiery answer on my part.
I love it.
That critique that just flies around out there and gets taken for granted.
Yeah, it's great, and I think it's very nuanced, and I really enjoy it. We've been spending a lot of time, I think, in our conversations. This theme keeps coming up. I'm really interested in exploring the psychology and neuroscience of what's been a risk analysis term, which is anti-fragility. And I hear you talking about proactively building some of these things. And I want to throw it to John. I've got one more question, though, because a term popped into my head, and I want to make sure I don't miscredit here, but I think it came from Paul Bloom's newer book, The Sweet Spot. Do you make a distinction between, let's call it, general suffering and chosen suffering? Let me give you an example he uses in the book. Right? Parents, right? And you're a parent of 2, I believe, correct? And happiness generally will go down, meaning and life satisfaction go up. to me, that's a distinctly different thing than, let's say, 3 accidental, unplanned pregnancies while in a context of poverty, right? And what can potentially be gained psychologically, affectively, skill-wise, characterized from those sorts of experiences. And I just wonder if you would create or identify some sort of distinguishment between choosing to do, Steve Magnus, do hard things versus really hard, adverse, unpleasant things kind of falling upon us.
Oh, I think that distinction is really clear and real. There are many, many things that happen to people, right? And also often we will choose to do things that are challenging, whether it's climbing Mount Everest or entering a graduate program or having children, marrying someone, or coming one way or another, whatever the form might be. Really, that's quite a challenging thing, right? So we meditating, saying, I will sit down for 40 minutes and simply just be with myself with as little distraction as possible. That's a deliberate challenge, to be sure. The question for me endlessly is, how do we deal with the endless waves of life? And metaphorically, through inner practice, the cultivation generally of various psychological factors, inner strengths that are well researched. There's so much literature around things like developing secure attachment, developing resilience, and so forth. What we do then is we're deepening the keel in our personal sailboat so that we're more able to dare greatly, as Brené Brown puts it, and we're more able to recover more rapidly if we get hit really hard. And we tend to be more resilient, which is not just about bouncing back, but resilient is really about maintaining a steady course with well-being along the way, with life's challenges, storms and so forth, and waves and currents banging on your personal vessel. And to me, that's an incredibly hopeful orientation. You cannot change the past. You can't change the moment as it arises, but you can always grow a little. You can always learn a little and grow a little and heal a little and let go a little and gain a little in the innermost temple of your being continuously, repeatedly, daily. And we're learning a lot more about the neuroplasticity of that, the actual changes in your brain. And as you know, I'm very interested in how we can turbocharge ourselves and steepen that process and steepen our growth curve and rate of healing and rate of acquisition of inner qualities that are the primary factors, really, of coping and fulfillment as we go through life. Right? How do we actually do that? I wanted to say, if I could, one last little thing about something you said a moment ago, and maybe even ask you about it. Part of the frame for me around green zone, red zone is that I'm trying to operationalize in an evolutionary neuropsychological way the second and third noble truths in Buddhism. Craving and not craving. Lots of craving, less craving. And craving is a drive state. Zebras crave the escape from the lion. As long as there's an enoughness in the present of the felt sense of needs met, craving really moves to the back burner, to a low simmer, and arguably can disappear entirely in the moment. And so I've gotten really interested in that, and that's a kind of a deeper framework of a way of looking at what the project is. Can we help ourselves be in the real, including as householders, taking on, writing a book, writing a podcast, right? Raising children, healing the planet. Can we take that on with as little craving as possible? And how do you actually do that, right? So for me, that's kind of a deeper context, if you will, for green zone, red zone. And there's a wonderful distinction. You may know it from Kent Berridge's work between liking and wanting, and not liking and not wanting, right? As they say, liking without wanting is heaven. Wanting without liking is hell. And I think very often when people are in the red zone, they're wanting, but they're not enjoying. And the way to stay in the green zone is to hold your likes lightly. And be careful about a brain that's designed to want what it likes.
Yeah, Kent Berridge's research on that is fascinating, on that distinction. And there's a lot we can learn from that about well-being.
Hi friends, Nick here with just a brief interlude to share with you an update on one of our newest partnerships with the Anti-Fragile Academy. Throughout John and I's conversations with many, if not most, of our guests, one thing has been made really clear. In order for people to flourish, thrive, experience the good life, they need to develop the capacity to not only navigate and endure, but ideally grow from the bad, grow from unpleasant experiences. That's why we're thrilled to be partnering with our newest sponsor, the Anti-Fragile Academy, an organization that I co-founded with Dr. Adam Wright, Director of Mental Performance for the Washington Nationals. At the Anti-Fragile Academy, we work with adolescent athletes, executives, and educators to help them understand some of the science, not just of optimal performance, but of well-being and anti-fragility. The ability not only to endure and bounce back from unpleasantness, but to actually come back stronger, to grow from it. Between Adam and I, we've worked with Fortune 100 companies, Inc. 300 executives, Division I programs, and elite professional athletes and Olympians from all over the world. To find out more about how you can leverage anti-fragility training, check out our website at theantifragileacademy.com.
Thank you so much, Rick. And various areas you described then offer so many segues into various other things we'd love to discuss: positive neuroplasticity, resilience, relationships, and so on. As one way into that, perhaps we could think about some practical advice for listeners for how to live in the green zone more. And there was a passage in your book, Making Great Relationships, which I have really enjoyed reading here, where you kind of summarize two key themes, which you've also mentioned there. The first, to spend more time in the green zone and less in the red, you write, first, develop and use psychological resources such as grit, self-worth, and interpersonal skills to meet your needs more effectively. And second, when it feels like a need is being sufficiently met in the present, slow down to take this experience into yourself. And this book will focus on the first, but perhaps you could elaborate on those two and any other core pieces of practical advice you have for listeners on how to spend more of their life in the green zone and less in the red.
Well, first, thank you for calling out those two fundamental ways to grow resilient well-being and grow the factors of flourishing. Okay. And I want to highlight something too. Having dived fairly deeply into the literature on character strengths, what's very striking about that literature is that of the 24 identified character strengths, and there are other models, of character strengths, psychological factors, there's almost entirely a focus on identifying them and using them. But there's almost no attention to their acquisition, which I think is a really important missing piece, and one that also really empowers people and emphasizes their agency as active learners rather than doing the best they can to identify and use what's already there, which is great. And also let's look at growing them further. So I'm so happy that you really highlighted that. I'm thinking of an example earlier in the day. So my wife, we're having some people do some plumbing, and she reminded me about it. They're coming, and it was on top of some prior reminders about it. And I understand it because I kind of can get preoccupied with my own work. Okay. And I work out of my home. So she reminded me, and right there, I want to use that as an example, if I could. So first off, I have repeatedly internalized the felt sense that she loves me, I love her, we're good. 42 years of marriage, we're good.
Wow.
So that stressor hit my brain, hit my mind, which grew up in a fault-finding, loving, but controlling and critical home, notably my mother. So the stimulus hits that little bit of emotional memory, understandably, but that impact gets buffered by the having developed over time, internalized into emotional memory, somatic memory, and so on, the knowing that she's cool, we're cool, it's all good, right? That's helpful. And then in the moment it occurred, there's some mindfulness in real time. You all have it as well, listeners too, of knowing, oh, this is the kind of thing that irks me. So I start to experience the initial twitch in my body, somatic marker, Antonio Damasio term of like, that kind of irritation, exasperation. But very quickly, I deliberately, almost automatically, am kind of tuning into, she loves me, we're good, and come on, Rick, chill. Blah, blah. You're going to, you'll pay a price if you go down the red zone road, or the red road, the green road. I'm going to pay a price if I go down the red road here. And then the whole thing just passes. And then I have the opportunity, and all this is happening in seconds. Now, this is with practice. I'm pretty trained at this, but people can acquire these skills over time. And they probably already relate to what I'm saying. And then having moved through that little episode within a few dozen seconds, there's a chance to just internalize again, staying even keeled, staying chill. It went well. I'm trying to train myself to increasingly go down the green road rather than the red road, when I'm at that fork with my wife. Went well, it's good. And reinforce it, incrementally, microscopically, maybe synaptically, one more cycle. That would be an example of certainly the first of these, the development over time, and then the using over time of what we're developing. And then more generally, I would say that underlying resource of all rightness with my wife, Jan, definitely is the result of thousands of little episodes, half a breath, a few seconds at a time, of letting it sink in that we're good. So that maybe, is that an example of what you're getting at? I wonder if you two might have examples.
Totally, yes, totally. And yeah, it's the second part that I found kind of most compelling and novel to me. Yeah. The idea of building and using psychological strengths. That's a whole large body of research on that, and it seems like a very sensible thing to do and quite straightforward. Obviously, very difficult, but the idea of when you're aware that you're in the green zone and that your needs sufficiently met. And perhaps also you're utilizing some strength, or that's contributed to the place you're in. Really being present and reflecting on that. And I don't want to oversimplify it, because where my head goes to is, it seems like a gratitude practice. I'm grateful that I'm resilient enough to cope with certain things, or gritty enough to do certain things. It's more than that, though, isn't it? It's recognizing your inner peace, if you like, your contentment in that moment, and so on.
Yeah, and if I could ask you, I want to ask you about this. So the model of, we have needs, it's biology. Our drives are activated when there's a deficit, going back to Maslow, of course, and the meeting of the needs. Right? There's a deficit of safety at the moment that the lion charges the zebras. That's a useful roadmap. And so I would say yes, when there's the opportunity to experience an enoughness of satisfaction. So could be the presence or the basis for opening into the presence of gratitude, thankfulness, contentment, a sense of accomplishment, goals attained, which is really, really important for those of us that are achievement oriented. I'm a recovering to-do-aholic, right? I'm still in deep recovery there. That's great. And also, I think of probably the primary need of all for safety. So when there's an opportunity to experience safe enough in the present, protected enough in the present, body's basically all right now, there's enough air to breathe, the heart's beating, and also a sense of moxie, inner strength, fortitude. Yeah, the lion may attack, or the equivalent these days, but I can count on what's inside me to deal with it, so I don't have to keep worrying about it all the time, right? Those would be opportunities to experience an enoughness already of safety in various ways, which are wonderful antidotes to anxiety. And it is very primary, right? Our most fundamental need of all is to live into the next moment, safety. And then, of course, connection. That's another primary need. This goes to, avoid, approach, and attach. Those three kind of motivational systems broadly that all animals have in their own species-specific ways. So yeah, there too. When you, like right now, I feel actually seen. Right now, I feel like this is cool. These are like two really bright dudes who are good-hearted as heck. Yeah.
We fooled you then.
Right now.
We got you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well,
Right
thank you
now.
so much.
Yeah.
Well, this is definitely a moment to be present and reflect on that and be grateful for it.
Rick, I really like your use of the word enoughness. Because in going through Hardwiring for Happiness and quotes about spotlighting and vacuuming and the negativity bias, and I've had these on various slide decks, always cited, of course, but I just love this language, red zone, green zone, and I just want to rehash the three things you're talking about: safety, connection, and satisfaction. And the reason I bring up enoughness is I think I always grappled with how to best understand the satisfaction piece. The safety piece made complete sense. The connection piece, easy. Satisfaction made sense, but I would find myself saying, well, if I feel, can I be satisfied with my levels of connection and safety? How is that different? And you just took us down a great track, gave good examples. The to-do-aholic, I think, was excellent. But when I heard you say enoughness, it's like, okay, well, those are three distinct buckets, if you will, for the green zone. And it's about enough of each one of those things. And so I've always loved the work, but that just clarified a little bit for me. I really appreciate it.
No, I'm really glad about that. And it is really interesting. Like, I'm temperamentally on the anxious spectrum. People tend to be, anxious, melancholy, or choleric, kind of irritable, aggressive. And I'm more on the anxious. I'm cheerfully anxious, So safety, I thought, wow, safety is huge. And also my childhood, there was a huge deficit of connection experiences with loving parents who are, for their individual reasons, poor at empathy. And then I was a very young, shy, dorky kid, a year and a half younger than most kids going through school. And so I thought, whoa, those are going to be my big issues. No, contentment, how to be ambitious, to be accomplishment oriented, to want to use actualize your capabilities. If you feel like you can run with the big dogs, you want to run with the big dogs. How can you do that? Wow. And also in a culture that tends to make us discontent. So I found that really paying attention to the felt sense of feeling content in the present has been really, 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 really helpful. And one other detail, you probably know it from the book, very loosely, the brain evolved in three essential stages. I think of the three floors of the house of the brain. It's a way for people to understand it. The minutia of the triune brain early model is somewhat disputed, but the fundamental distinctions between the brainstem structures and then the subcortical areas of the amygdala and hippocampus, and then the neocortex, particularly being built out in primates and then humans, there's a meaningful distinction there in terms of functional organization and development in time. And very loosely, as a useful fiction, I think, we can relate each of those three primary needs to each of those three floors of the house of the brain. So primary need for regulating basic ongoing homeostasis in the body, the heart is beating, breathing is occurring, the viscera are being regulated, brainstem functions, and particularly with emotions that have to do with preventing or avoiding threats, safety, in other words, disgust and terror or fear, or rage, very early primary emotions, that crocodiles can seem to experience something like. And then we have the subcortical area, which is really building out motivational systems, mammals who could hunt at night, bringing in more emotional nuance, building out basal ganglia systems around liking and wanting. So now you have a lot of material there related to satisfaction. And then we have profoundly social primates and extraordinarily profoundly social humans, really building out systems for attaching and bonding and compassion and connection. So very, very loosely, we have that structure. And that leads me then to my kind of completely goofy formulation that as we move through our day, we need to pet the lizard, feed the mouse, and hug the monkey. Again and again and again and again. And that's a way of, I think, not trivializing or oversimplifying things, but actually realizing, wow, I need to really calm that inner part of me that's scared a lot. It's frail, it's fragile, it's worried, right? Which also neuroplasticity decreases as you go down the neuroaxis. So the people can learn things related to connection a lot more rapidly than they can learn related to addiction and satisfaction, which is even more rapid than they can unlearn trauma that involves profound threats to safety. So therefore, if we're going to deal with safety issues, we tend to need a lot of corrective emotional experiences, satisfaction issues, definitely some, connection issues, certainly some there. But it, for me, leads into a kind of respect for the primacy of threats to safety and the importance of really continuing to take that into account. Mm-hmm. Hopefully that's useful for
That's
people.
Great. Yeah, it's very useful.
Oh yeah. This is so powerful. I'm sure you've had this many times, Nick, but there's been moments in some of our episodes when I've had these big kind of like, whoa, realizations of, this distinction. In this case, it's, this distinction between red zone and green zone in my own life. I now understand actually how I've dealt with certain experiences. Like, I was actually in the green zone there, having been through the red zone, and my behavior was indicative of that. That's why I was scratching my head a lot there and my chin.
Yeah. Have either of you done things that are physically hazardous while enjoying them? Skiing, scuba, rock climbing?
In my case, yeah, scuba diving. In my case, very short term ones like bungee jumping and skydiving, rather than the longer term thing like skiing for a whole day. I haven't done any of that. Nick probably has.
Yeah. How about you, Nick?
I think it depends on what you qualify as hazardous. But certainly, I think the simple answer is yes. I mean, the most immediate things that come to mind, and we talked before we started, the recording, kind of a national park hopper. So really, really long day hikes through oftentimes kind of bear infested country, like huge drop offs, like kind of short, or I should say narrow trails, right? With kind of those sorts of things. I'm sure if I thought about it, there'd be some other examples, but yeah, certainly.
Yeah, you can think of those examples or occupations like being a first responder, firefighter, police officer, working in an ER, in hazardous conditions, medical environment, with or without COVID added. And in both your cases, were I bet you probably were not panicking. Jumping out of an airplane, I haven't yet done that, but so I imagine there's something there. But you were able to cope. In other words, you were able to stay in the green zone, as it were, in the core of your being, while in hazardous, threat-saturated environments. And it just speaks to the ways in which we can develop inner strengths, inner resources, character strengths, factors, and so on, that enable us to deal with challenges that can be escalating over time to safety, satisfaction, and connection, while still feeling okay in the core of our being. Another one of that is intimate, vulnerable conversation. Whoa. Sure. I've known a number of people, mainly men, who have tremendous courage on physical challenges, and yet interpersonally, oh boy, being vulnerable and open is so scary. So how do we resource ourselves there to sustain vulnerability and openness? But we can develop those things over time.
So that offers a wonderful segue into something else we'd love to discuss with you. We'll discuss in more detail because you have touched upon it quite a lot. But we've spent a lot of time in various episodes talking about resilience and navigating difficult emotional experiences, also difficult physical experiences, stress, and so on. But we haven't had many opportunities to speak to someone with a clinical background about these, right? You've just mentioned your own experience in these areas. So Yeah, so let's go into the red zone a bit more, thinking about resilience, trauma, stress management, and so on. Let's start by distinguishing these terms. I mean, how would you distinguish between trauma, stress, discomfort, and then we can go into resilience and its role in all this?
Yeah. It's a fuzzy distinction, but basically trauma has to do with that which is overwhelming. Overwhelming at the time and potentially overwhelming whenever it's re-experienced or recalled. And it's a fuzzy distinction between a traumatic experience and a just awful experience, that's basically the fuzzy distinction. And one of the also common factors in trauma is that if it's overwhelming, a person might dissociate around it. So then it goes into memory decoupled from its context. And that means then when it's reactivated or re-experienced, the person doesn't know why it's there, but it's just overwhelming. It just affects them in overwhelming ways. So a lot of the treatment for trauma is about recovering access to it and being able to tolerate experiences of it. And as Peter Levine wonderfully teaches in his approach called somatic experiencing, think of trauma as having to do with, like I said, overwhelming, a blocked adaptive response. The zebra gets away from the lion, it's probably not traumatic, right? The zebra, I don't know, let's say is physically attacked, horribly mauled, somehow lives through it, but was unable to escape from the mauling. There would be a blocked adaptive response. And then you can think of human versions of that, of the 6-year-old who is mistreated, alert warning here, potentially molested, abused in some way, can't possibly escape from it, can't possibly stand up to it, or hit back, or fight back, or say the things an adult could be able to say. They can't whip out their credit card and get a car and get out of there, right? It's blocked. So then you have therapeutic treatments and approaches that help people to complete the trajectory that was thwarted, the coping trajectory in therapy today, through acting it out, saying the things that couldn't be said, imagining protectors coming in who were absent when you were young, so you can kind of work your way through it, for example. So these are just different ways, even clinically, of understanding trauma and unpacking approaches to dealing with it.
You feel that, or think that trauma is a word that's overused in many contexts today? Do you think we should distinguish between it and other concepts, other things, or levels of trauma more?
Yeah, that's a great question. Maybe there's a little bit of a trivializing of it. You find this a lot, construct creep. I think of it like mission creep. The U.S. and Iraq, mission creep, or Vietnam. It's forgive the examples, right? So I've clinically suddenly now everybody is, a significant number of people are, being described as on the autism spectrum. Well, maybe they're just a highly introverted person who's very bright and interested in ideas and machinery. Doesn't mean they're on that and socially awkward, but I have to be careful about this. I'm not so sure about terminology like collective trauma, but on the other hand, I think it is interesting to not be a fuddy-duddy, rigid about terminology and go, oh, that's interesting, how to think about a kind of a collective response to this hopeless dread of the climate catastrophe that is inexorably approaching and the beginning of which is already upon us. So maybe there is some meaning there. On the other hand, I do think actually that bringing out trauma is a very helpful way for many people to realize that what happened when they were kids or what their first partner did to them was not merely crummy. It was genuinely a medical issue. It was biologically traumatizing, physiologically traumatizing, and to really honor it and respect it. So I'm really glad, actually, that people are contemplating on trauma. Now, that said, myself, I would describe myself as having had an emotionally C- childhood.
Okay.
A lot due to my own doing. Now that even though I have agency, children have agency, they don't have responsibility. It's a huge distinction. But to face your agency, even retrospectively as a child, it's an important thing. It can be very tricky because you don't want to blame the victim, but to make that distinction is useful. And so I particularly by the time someone's a teenager and has a pretty coherent sense of themselves and their intentions. So anyway, I was part of the system. Still, it landed on me as a C-. I would not say I've been traumatized ever in my life. I've had many difficult, painful, challenging experiences, some of them nearly lethal, but they weren't they were not traumatic, right? So I want to acknowledge that, when we talk about this topic.
Somewhat related question, but I'm wondering if you touched on this a little bit earlier, whether or not you see a lot of, I think, misconceptions about resilience, right? What it means, it requires. I want to get into your comment about agency as well, and how we are resilient or can be resilient. But I think you'll see things like, mental toughness, suck it up sort of attitudes.
That's right.
Kind of like there's I think
Stress
a conceptualization. Yeah, that it's very rigid in some ways, right? And kind of an unbendable characteristic, if you will, as opposed to having, like we talked about, acceptance, command, a little bit of flexibility within some say boundaries of rigidity. So just how do you think about resilience? You mentioned earlier kind of maintaining equilibrium. Sometimes people talk about bouncing back, but you've used phrases like kind of a resilient well-being as well. And I'd love to just dig into the nuances a little bit more.
Yeah. So resilience is a means to an end. It's a means to the end of coping, and it's a means to the end of maintaining well-being along the way.
Okay.
Second point, well-being is a factor of resilience, especially when well-being is repeatedly internalized. Gradually tweaking and tuning our physiology and leaving traces behind in emotional memory and implicit memory in particular. So well-being and resilience can support each other in a positive cycle. Resilience also certainly is about surviving the worst day of your life. It's also, much more importantly, thriving, to use your word, every day of your life. While, like that sailboat, managing the waves and the currents and the storms of life while continuing to pursue, your important goals. Resilience is what enables us to do that. So I think people often speak of resilience in an overly narrow and an unnecessarily narrow frame. And it's really important to appreciate its benefits for functioning and maintaining well-being in the face of everyday challenges, which for many people, poverty, almost one in 5 kids in America lives in poverty. Wow. Think about that family system and that child. Just getting through the day takes a lot of resilience, right? And having something left over for those you love at the end of that day. So that's really important. And then bouncing back is a very interesting term. I think it is true that people can return to baseline. So resilience helps us return to baseline. There's that sailboat metaphor again.
Right.
There we are. It's also true that, as people have pointed out in terms of the notion of the hedonic treadmill, that there are a lot of issues with that notion, that somehow we just simply return to our prior equilibrium state, the thermostat setting of our mood, let's say. Well, actually, no. For one, negative experiences have much more enduring impact. The negativity bias. So there's a asymmetry between the effects of various things in terms of the affective treadmill, returning to baseline. Second, there's plenty of evidence that people can gradually come out of negative moods of anxiety and depression over time. So they're stabilizing a new, better equilibrium condition. Their treadmill speed, or I don't know what you want to call it, the joy factor on the treadmill has definitely changed over time. And then many people, I bet you all included, would say maybe it's over a 5-year time span, as the Dalai Lama talks about, but you can look back and you can go, I actually am. If I were to rate my overall global well-being and flourishing and thriving today compared to 5 years ago, I've kind of made some progress, So there's movement on that treadmill. And so I think there can be certainly recovery to your baseline. So we'll call that bouncing back. You've returned to your baseline. And then post-traumatic growth, sometimes there can be gains from the pain.
Mm-hmm.
You learn things. You have, people who go through like a serious medical problem, often physicians or people in healthcare will write about their own encounter with cancer or a heart attack or a stroke and so forth. And there are gains there, like a sense of common humanity and humility. I've recently recovered from COVID, my first bout, and not a horrible case, kind of 3 crummy weeks. And I have the privilege of enjoying being sick in that it doesn't feel good. I'm happy to get through it, but it opens me into a sense of frailty and, inner being, interdependence, and connectedness with my fellow primates from whom I got this illness. Anyway, so that would be a form of growth. That would be an example of growing from a difficult situation.
That's also an example of you being in the green zone, right? Where you're reflecting,
being able to as context for it and
capability.
Yeah, and I think it is true, that you definitely can make people tougher by boot camps of various kinds. Yeah, and I've gained in various ways through rock climbing and other, intense wilderness experiences. But let's not ever forget that there's also are many other really important ways to build up inner toughness, inner hardiness in the face of stressors. Like, for example, the felt sense that others love you. Huge factor of stress hardiness. Research on U.S. Marines going into the Middle East and so forth, same circumstances, why do some get PTSD, post-traumatic stress, why do some not? And same situations, exactly. And there are certain variables that are major factors. One is a sense of mission and purpose, legitimate, moral purpose there. And second, a sense of camaraderie, right? And third, attention to agency, what you do have control over. Well, think of those as none of those has to do with somebody in boot camp screaming in your face. They're the opposite of that. And yet they are major factors of resilience in the face of enormous challenges.
Yeah. Rick, time flies when you're having fun. We're already, I can't believe we're already coming up on the end here. You referenced it earlier. We didn't even get to really kind of, bite off some of the meat around relationships, which is, I think, a critical topic here. Perhaps you'll come back on again for a second installment at some point.
Complete delight.
Well, we would really enjoy it as well. Awesome. So we'll try to arrange that if you're willing. We certainly appreciate it. But before we start to kind of sign off, just where can people engage with you? I mean, please mention the podcast. It's so terrific. But where can they kind of interact with you, your content, some of the training and ideas and meditations? There's so much good stuff out there that you and Forrest provide.
Oh, thank you. That's kind of you. Best way is just search on my name. Google me, Rick Hanson, S-O-N, rickhanson.com. It's a website that's a library. It's chock full of freely offered resources, a few things for sale, online programs, which always have scholarships for anyone who wants one. So that's there. We have the Being Well podcast, which Forrest has really developed. It's brilliant. It's grown. It's great. Recommend it. And I'd also like to give a nod to an initiative that I'm involved with now called the Global Compassion Coalition. The notion of how do we create a new kind of global commons in which people can come together at the scale of millions, literally, across national boundaries, across religious lines, and across many fraught lines, to come together for the common good. All of us together in a larger context in which most people have been living in Game of Thrones for much of the last 10,000 years, at odds with our primate nature to live on the basis of caring and sharing, compassion and justice inside our small bands. So the Global Compassion Coalition.org is definitely something to check into.
Awesome. Great. We'll put all of those obviously linked in our show notes here. But again, we're looking forward to hopefully a second visit, really digging into the relationship piece among many other areas of, I think, your knowledge and expertise. But thank you so much for spending time with us today. We're deeply appreciative.
Honestly, it's been a delight to be with both of you individually, who clearly radiate benevolence. I thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rick. Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening to Flourish FM. We hope you enjoyed the content. Please be sure to leave us a 5-star review and hit that subscribe button wherever you listen to your podcast and on all major social media platforms.
And if you visit our website, flourishfmpodcast.com, you can sign up to our newsletter. We send out a weekly newsletter. First newsletter of every month, we share a long-form blog. And every newsletter, every week, we share highlights from our previous episodes. Please hit subscribe on our website.